Hey guys, this is Bradley here, and I'd like to start off with making a quick apology for being so late. I haven't been posting many updates, and I'm actually a little bit behind in my classwork, but I don't want to stress too much on the details. I'd rather just get into what I've been up to. So I'm a little late on this assignment. This is actually a spatial reference for an environment that I wanted to create and do a little bit of procedural stuff. In fact, while this is the one that I really wanted to do, I ended up going with something closer to this. And if you look, these are all a lot of minimalist modern interior architecture, which I'm a huge fan of. The lighting is very clean and it is very straightforward. But in this scenario, actually, it kind of is, it accentuates the very straight, very geometric kind of style here, which I'm a big fan of. And if we look at the materials, it's a lot of what I just call white interior architectural visualization. In fact, I always name these like ArchViz shaders in Unreal or Houdini or whatever because it's so like bland, but it works. Like that's part of the style. But there's a lot of wood and a lot of tile. This is wood, wood, wood. There's actually kind of a metal, which I really like the scene, but didn't quite have the time to do another wood. So that was the main sort of couple materials that I worked. Part of this assignment was to actually include some sort of procedural asset, which I just wasn't a fan of the result. So I'm going to go ahead and show you that particular asset. So what I worked on here, I did this simple, wrong, there we go. I did this simple scene. It literally consists of this table, surface, chair, this cabinet, and this kind of room, and I just wasn't pleased with the results. In fact, I couldn't even get this to render out in Mantra, and it was starting to look good, but it was just being silly. I ran into some displacement issues, and note that the surface model is not mine, nor is this chair model, but everything else I did do myself with a simple HDR scene. So we're actually going to back out of here, and I really just want to showcase the cabinet array. We don't need anything else in here. What this little doodad is, I just duplicated them 3 times. You get your cabinet dimensions, its height, and when you make it taller, look at that. It kind of, adds more shelves based off that. But I wasn't pleased with the results of this. It's also broken. If we look, each time that I add it, there's a lot of space up there. I just was not in the mood to tune it. I don't know, I was just feeling uninspired, and rather than give BS excuses, I thought I'd just move on to something different. So that is the scenario with this, and this will go to infinity, but again, the more you add, the bigger this space is. I messed it up, and it also doesn't auto-assign materials. Totally fine for the purposes of a game engine because these are still 2 separate materials, but it doesn't auto-assign like the new material. So if you were using this in a Houdini scene in Mantra, you're kind of SOL there because it doesn't do that. Also, it doesn't work upside down, and I'm not surprised. I've never taken it to negative dimension, but you wouldn't want to do that. So I guess I should add like a constraint so it doesn't ever go below 0. Again, just little things that I kind of missed out on. Enough of that. Let's go ahead and look in Unreal and talk a little bit about this scene. I didn't even get the cabinets in here because I just, like I said, I was just uninspired. I didn't like it, but I think the textures turned out kind of all right for what I was wanting to use them for. Maybe this one could be a little higher resolution. Still couldn't, having some troubles with HDR lighting, so I ended up just using a skylight, baked out really high quality lighting. It is super bland in here. I kind of made a couple quick like noise functions to like, get some nice detail in there to actually make it look like it was painted over so it wasn't so plain. But aside from that, it's just this oak wood kind of tileable that I made, and then this other dark wood kind of tileable. So let's go ahead and take in a quick look at that while we still have some time here. Go into substance. This is the oak wood, and like I said, it's just all procedural. Use the tile generator. Where's my tile? Yeah. Use a brick generator. Actually, not tile generator, brick generator, but with 0 bezel, because I kind of wanted it to feel like just panels of oak wood kind of thrown there. Like I said, just various noise functions added, multiplied, all that jazz. The gradial map took a while to get right. I actually used a lot of references of actual oak wood walls and similar materials until I could find the right one. And if I'm honest, I still might want to go with something different. But with the magic of with the magic of Substance, we can still change our seed to get the look to be a little different, which is what I did back in here. These are the same texture, but I just threw in a different seed so they wouldn't be exactly the same. These are exactly the same if I'm not mistaken. And if we look at the material for the dark wood, it's kind of the same scenario. I actually think that I started with a base of a different wood that I kind of liked what it was going with, and then it ended up just having it basically be a really dark gradient, which I'm still not quite a fan of. And the viewport here doesn't do it much justice because I haven't quite tuned specular and roughness the way that they should be. But now that I've done a little bit of studying and have a better understanding, I know where to go to fix this. But the real meat of what I wanted to talk about was what I really wanted to turn in. This bad boy. Oh, guess I need to turn that back on. Give it a second. This is my city generator. This doodad is where I really wanted to spend the meat of the last couple weeks. And while at first it might look somewhat simplistic, you start with some models, scatter points across your arbitrary geometry, and go from there. I needed to follow a video and do something a little more advanced than that. For me personally, it just wasn't good enough to have a simple tool to just scatter points across and be done with it. I wanted to take on a more of a technical art, more of a technical TD kind of stance with this. So what would be super helpful for people doing procedural things? How about a procedural city generator? So this doodad is actually pretty cool. We have our city blocks. If you load in your arbitrary geometry, which in this case, I made just a simple planar model that represents our guy. We're basically going to go through and group the blocks that we want. Say our city blocks, these ones are going to be arbitrary group A, and then the rest are going to be arbitrary group B. In this case, these are for like commercial towers. In fact, you can see that as it's reflected over here. These are where our commercial buildings live, and these are our housing buildings. We do a little bit of Python. There's actually going to be a lot of repeating Python to isolate and move them to the origin so we can do our simulations on them. From there, we're actually going to look at our buildings. In this scenario, I borrowed 70 buildings from a Pluralsight course. This tool was designed to be used in a production setting. And as a TD, I wouldn't be modeling these. In fact, even maybe the environment artists wouldn't necessarily be modeling every single building. Or maybe some of them would, but the final guys who are going to do the level layout or level design may not be designing these. And that's the point. You just point this bad boy to the path where your buildings live and click your import. And that will actually, in fact, let me show it. If I go and, excuse me, delete all these nodes and then go back out. Now my skyline's probably going to be complaining because, oh, guess what? Oops. Oh, damn it. Fuck. Excuse me. Oh, jeez. Yeah, okay, there we go. My skyline's going to be complaining because, look, it doesn't actually have a source of buildings now. But if we go back into my buildings and click import, it's going to take its time to do its thing. Hit layout, and boom, bada bing, bada boom. We now have all of our buildings back. It imports all of them. So if you had, if you had 10 buildings, it's no big deal to drop a file node, drop an attribute, create to get the right attributes for it, and then merge them all together, maybe even switch between the two different kinds of buildings. But in a production setting where you absolutely need to have things be done procedurally so you're saving time, it's super handy to be able to load in, say, 100 buildings at once, which it would. This scales infinitely. It doesn't matter how many buildings you feed it. Now, does that mean that it's like smart to give it 1,000 buildings? Maybe, if that's what you need, but you better have a system to back it up. So that's what this part's doing now. Here we actually need to go and make building clusters. This is the interesting part, kind of. We get our different buildings, maybe some smaller commercial buildings, which in this scenario is to act as like a filler for the middle area. And then we have our data saved in here. There's no reason that I couldn't output each of these clusters to its own file. Rather, I just took a null and froze it because these bounding boxes pretty much take up no space. So I'd rather not be dealing with a lot of files. This is my filler cluster. Again, the filler is the middle part to ensure that we, well, this is probably going to be complaining, so this is going to have to go and rebake. But if you saw the towers, yeah, there we go. So if you look here in the towers, boy, it's going to, oh, it failed. Did not appreciate that. If we look here, that's what those filler clusters mean, the like center of these buildings. So if we go back into the building clusters, it goes and generates this. This is pretty much just a simple pop simulation. Actually, that will just go through and advect everything into the center. And that's basically just how it's going to fit it. It uses the dimensions of the bounding box to ensure that we don't get any overlapping geometry, and it fits it into a cluster. Of course, I have 600 frames here just to ensure that everything gets to settle down so we don't have buildings on top of buildings or buildings at weird angles. So if we go back up here into my building cluster, that is all that is doing. We have a box that represents our ground object. It doesn't necessarily get its dimensions from the city blocks, however, so keep that in mind, but that's not a big deal. In fact, it looks like, yeah, we see one of our city blocks kind of sitting on top. You can see how that's going. Okay, so let's go back out into our actual simulation. This is the meat of everything, and it's going to be complaining because some attribute probably doesn't exist or whatever. I need to go and fix something. Irrelevant. I'll save that for another day. This was working, as you can clearly see. It basically takes in the city blocks that we created earlier and then decides how it wants to scatter each block and fit them within the dimensions of the individual block geometry that you gave it. That's pretty much all this is doing, making sure everything fits, packing it to get the right attributes. And in fact, part of the reason that I'm having this issue is because this node is not pulling in the right kind of attribute. That's all. That's all that's complaining about, which probably stems from here, from something in the actual city blocks not doing its deal. But I'm not going to talk too much more about that. And then here we go and import the blocks that we actually rendered out as wedges, which is all the whole city block simulation was pretty much getting passed into here, that we can render each chunk of these out as BGO wedge files. And then finally my skyline. We're just going to go back and import those, add in a little bit of paintable height mesh, so height data, so we can actually paint where we want taller buildings to be. So it is a little bit artist friendly, and then we convert it to height, do some ray casting to fit everything again. And here we actually just have a simple switch to do a full res preview or a bounding box preview. So you can see everything represented by bounding boxes or everything not represented by bounding boxes. This Python node over here is what's going to do the final assembly of stacking each of these buildings, because they aren't all one whole, building file, but they absolutely could be. And then you have your final output. This is the part that gets sent to geometry. So I do want to take a second to talk about, hey, where does this fall short? This falls short in a number of ways. It still needs to be more artist friendly. Some things are kind of all over the place, and it's quite difficult to actually go in and say, oh, well, I want there to be more houses. I want the blocks to be more houses. So, okay, well, we need to go into the building cluster. We need to change this switch to get more of the commercial buildings, and then we might want to use in this switch, say like this third cluster, to change things up a little bit. And it's going to complain it's not going to change anything because I'd have to go and re-render it out, and that's part of the problem. Then I'd have to go back into my out, I'd have to re-render these wedges, which they're going to fail because some attribute's not in the right place. These are things that artists shouldn't have to deal with, but technically do to get this to work. Also, there's some of the Python uses absolute referencing. In fact, it prints out in a file the path to the city blocks, which is cool because then it can grab it later to re-import them. But this is absolute. If you bring this to a system where this hard drive isn't the E drive, my external is mapped E on this computer because I have 3 drives in, but maybe on my laptop it's mapped D because I don't, right? With that scenario, this isn't portable. We'd have to go and actually change this by hand, and that can suck if you've got 100 city blocks. I've got 4, no big deal. So we do need to fix that. That's kind of a next step kind of a deal. Which again ties back into this not working immediately, also with the attributes kind of freaking out because it's importing things a little differently per system. That also needs to be looked at. Also, most of this tool is offline, so you click a button in here to import your buildings, and then you have to go and let everything cook, like my city block sim, and then I have to go out to bake the wedges, and then I have to export again. If you're using this in a game scenario, you'd simply want to shoot it the path of what the buildings are, click a button, and then it does everything and spits you back out the geometry. You want to change? You make a change to one parameter already there instead of having to dive into a node, recook it, and then there it goes. Or better yet, it recooks it automatically per change, which could get expensive. So for film, this is kind of fine because it's part of the pipeline. You might be working in different software, but for game engines, it's definitely going to be annoying to have to constantly switch programs and re-import geometry. And also, this geometry is heavy, as we can see by what my computer is kind of chugging along here. Of course, that's dependent on what your modelers give you, so there's no reason that this geometry has to be this heavy for games. Maybe a lot of this could be off put to texture data, like the windows, especially in a, maybe not all of this is something you could get up close to. Maybe these aren't all hero assets. So if this was a flyby, this would work perfectly to have all of this just be height map texture data, you know? And we'd also want to change the density of the buildings down so we wouldn't be having terrible frame rates. But what does work well is that it scales very, very well. If I want more city blocks, I scale the size of my clusters or the geometry I give it to represent the actual blocks, scale that up, and it will scatter more points and fit more buildings. Not something that actually should be a parameter, but again, just isn't, because I wanted to get this out ASAP. And it automates the same regardless of the buildings you give it. You just have to follow the naming scheme that you set up when I was building this tool. I built this tool based off of a simple numbering scheme of like 10XX is commercial buildings and 00XX is non-commercial buildings. So that might limit me to 99 non-commercial and commercial buildings or whatever. But there are other ways to do it, and it wouldn't be difficult to adjust this tool to a different naming scheme. That is pretty much about it. That's definitely more of a direction that I wanted to go with this. I feel much better about this work. I might want to use more buildings because you can tell where the repeating is. It's very heavy because there's not that many different buildings. But again, this tool scales. You feed it different buildings and it will choose from different buildings. I might want to add in a bias to prevent certain buildings from not being over duplicated. And I'll definitely want to maybe add in a system to also put more stuff on top of these buildings. Like the top could have different cell towers and different radio antenna and whatever. And same for these commercial ones over here. Maybe some of them can have satellite dishes. In fact, maybe even a procedural road generator to fit in between these geometries and then build like highways or whatever based on whatever I specify. That's definitely a next step. But I would like to thank you for taking the time to watch this and kind of browse through it. And there's the result. I will post in a later video the result of exporting this into Unreal. Unfortunately, it will be clay as I just will not have time to build all these different textures. But again, if we were in a modeling scenario, or if this was a scenario where I was a tech artist, I would reckon a lot of those things would somewhat be built for me and I wouldn't have to do too much adjustment. So thank you guys, and I hope you catch me in the next video.